Welcome to the Sunday Superversive Livestream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and we should be broadcasting across the board from YouTube to UATV on this Super Bowl Sunday. But in reality, we are here for a different subject. That is Jaji's new Kickstarter concerning the art and craft of writing romance. And with Anthony Marchetta, we have her on today. How are you doing, Jaji?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And I figure that art and craft of writing romance is right on topic for Valentine's Day.
It is. It is.
And it still can be subversive.
It's true. Actually, I would.
Hey, Anthony.
It's one of those things where it's not superversive. That's when we get societal viral diseases.
There's an interesting. Yeah, that's actually an interesting thought. Like, what would a non-superversive version of a romance look like? Not that that's like a particularly difficult question, but the answer is interesting, I think, because my first thought is like pornography. You get 50 Shades of Grey, right? Which, are we all agreed that's a pornography book? I think we are, right?
Yeah. So I actually had an experience that kind of speaks to your question. Once upon a time, I was invited to write an article. In fact, this Kickstarter, the articles are based or inspired by this article. Like this, that was the first thing, and I worked out the lessons that I taught about writing romance initially from this article. That I was asked to write for a book of articles about Anita Blake, the vampire hunter girl.
Oh yeah.
And,
okay.
I had been a big fan of Anita Blake back when she was a Catholic virgin. And somewhere between Catholic virgin and monster slut, they lost me. And my article was called, I'll actually pull up the name because the article was kind of funny. But the point of what I was going to say before I get to my article was I wrote about romance and the needs of culture versus the needs of drama, which is part of what my ideas in these classes are. The needs of culture being what your culture wants you to put in the story. In other words, it's woke or it's Christian or whatever culture is calling upon you to do. Like not writing too many bodice rippers was a cultural decision. Versus the needs of drama, where, of course, a bodice ripper is more dramatic than not. Bodice ripper being, where the guy's forceful as opposed to not.
Right.
And so I wrote this article about romance and Anita Blake. But the author who had started writing this virgin Catholic girl who was in love with two guys, one of whom was based on her husband, the author apparently decided that her marriage didn't have enough free sex in it, divorced the husband, had their character dump the guy based on the husband and go off with all these monsters. And she hated my article because it talked about romance. So the blurb at the beginning of that became before my article in the book actually explains that the author hated my article.
Amazing. Yeah, I've had nothing quite as dramatic as the author that I wrote the article about hated it, but I've had bad reviews that I've wanted to use for I want to use this for my for a blurb on my next book.
So here, the article. Well, let me just say this and then you get on. The article was called "Dating the Monsters: Why It Takes a Vampire or a Werewolf to Win the Heart of the Modern It Girl." And I can sum up my theory in one line, which is men have to act like wimps and ask for consent nowadays in romances, but monsters are allowed to ravage girls, so they're sexier. Go ahead with what you were saying.
No, excellent. Yeah, because I've been reading on your blog, and I was also I was around for the original art and craft of writing. I used that. Yep. Read the book version of it. Found it excellent. Really, really, really good. I even was in some of the classes that you put out for that, though I ended up having to leave earlier because I was really, really busy at the time. But and probably shouldn't have entered the class, but that's another story.
I still really enjoyed what you were writing. I hope you finish it at some point.
I want to, which is one of the reasons, though, that I was actually have been actively looking forward to this, because like what I am writing is a romance, which like it's funny because it 100% is, like there's really no way that you could not classify it that way. But when I bring it up to people and I point out that it's a romance, they go like, "Oh yeah, I guess it is." Like it's not obvious because it's an adaptation. I've mentioned it on the stream before, so it shouldn't be a surprise to our listeners. Like it's an adaptation of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus and Eurydice, of course, being one of the all-time great classic love stories in mythology and world history. Right? The singer whose love song is so beautiful that it moves the stone heart of the god of the dead. So it's definitely a love story, and yet, like, I think people think of the idea more as like a mythological adaptation. Like that's the first category it slots into in their brain of, oh, you're doing a myth adaptation. But I've always go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that might be in part because the myth tends to take place after the romance. But if you're going to tell the story, there's no reason not to tell the lead up to, because of course, the more you understand about why he loved her so much, the more meaning it has when he tries to get her back. If you understand what I mean by that.
Yes. So I say all of this to say that I've been following what you've been saying about the needs of culture and the needs of drama and wondering what I could do with something like that. So let's use what I have currently, which is unfinished, as a test case here. It's your course, right? I think this is an interesting way of doing it that might make people listen, right? Like it's your course. So I have my character. He's Orpheus, and he is a slave in the palace of the Athenian king. And he falls in love with the handmaid of the queen, who is also a slave. So what would you do? Like how do I turn this into a romance that's really going to make people go like, oh yeah, this is really touching? Eurydice dies and everybody's sobbing on the ground. What do you do with that?
Well, really, writing a romance is not that different from writing anything else, in that the way you make something poignant is you show how much somebody wants it there, and then you take it away. So, you show how much difference she makes in his life, how she improves him and makes him happy and makes him hopeful, and how he has ideas of what's going to happen. In other words, the thing that's the most poignant usually is when I've been picturing how we're going to be old together, and now here you are dead in my arms. You know what I mean? So,
it's the old
you
joke.
work at it.
I was gonna say it's the old joke in cop movies where they go like, whenever the cop starts talking about how his daughter's ballet recital is that day, he's gonna die.
Yeah, or he's about to retire or anything like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a joke when it's done quickly in a movie, but if you do it with a little care, it's really poignant. I remember one time picking up a couple of books. I think it was by James Patterson. It was some really popular author who's just kind of writes really quick popcorn stuff. And I was actually impressed with how much it pulled on the heartstrings. And I'm like, okay, this guy is writing something really quick and he's tossing it off clearly, and it's not deep, but he's got down how to pull on the heartstrings. And he was actually like the favorite author of my neighbor. It's a friend of mine. And it made me realize that some things we think, okay, this is just going to be trite, but it's not trite if you do it well. I mean, Oda in One Piece also is just the master of taking a really short backstory and making it like the most painful thing you could possibly imagine. And in both cases, that's the kind of thing you want to do for a romance that ends in a tragedy. You want or might end in a tragedy, where that looks like, or any romance really, because you always want to give the impression they might be torn apart. One of the secrets to romance is almost always motion in the other direction. The more the character pulls against the fact they're attracted to the person, the stronger the romance tends to be. So they have to have good reasons to go, oh, this person is so wonderful, but I can't. You know what I mean? Or I hate him, even though they clearly also like him. So the more that it's pulling in the other direction is one part of romance. The other part of romance is painting it so that the reader wants them to get together. I often use the example from the movie Sleepless in Seattle because it's a really quick, simple image to get across. The girl is on the phone, is listening to a radio story. I talk on the radio. The guy's wife is dead. His daughter wants to get him a new date. She's called in some kind of, Ask Betty or something like that. And the main character is peeling an apple in one piece so that the apple peel comes off in one piece and doesn't break all the way around the apple. And the little girl mentions that her mom used to do that. Now, the ability to peel an apple so that it doesn't come off is not something that useful in life. If you happen to know two people who do it, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But in a story, it was like a sign, like a symbol, where the viewer went, oh my gosh, this girl must be the girl for him because she has that quality, you see. Well, that's kind of what you want to do in a romance. You want to find something that the guy needs or wants, and you want the girl to fill, like a lock and a key. You want her to fill the part that he's missing. So you got to kind of set it up that way. And then you want him, once he falls for her, to picture what their life is going to be like. And then you want that to be interfered with. And either they overcome the obstacle, or if it's a tragedy, they don't overcome the obstacle. So, the key would be to really drawing the degree to which them being together makes them happy and they're perfect for each other, so that when she dies, it's just unbearable, which is a sad thing to do to a reader, but we understand exactly what we mean.
Right. Well, you were saying too about, go ahead, Ben.
It's almost a matter of managing watcher, reader, whatever perceptions more than even the actions that are there. He happens to eat an apple. She happens to tell a story, but the meaning is brought from our observing it,
right,
rather than from their realization.
Right. You need to put across to the reader. Most of my advice about romance comes from the romance genre, but it's equally applicable to a romance in any kind of genre, But particularly in a romance book, but also in any book you want to romance, you want the reader to come to the conclusion that they should come together even before they do. Now, it's not always that way. Sometimes one of the characters is already in love with the other one right off or something like that. But the more you can make the reader feel, oh, those guys are so perfect together, I really hope they come together, the better. And often you can do it with these little things that would be gimmicks if you do them badly, but they're heartwarming or heartrending, depending, if you do them with even a little bit of skill. And that's what surprised me when the time I was studying the James Patterson book. It was like, you didn't have to be super subtle about it, and it was still powerful. You know what I mean?
Yeah, what I was going to say is it's something that you talked about in the past, where you said that when you read TV tropes, you realized, this is actually like not a great thing. Because, and to be fair to TV tropes, I guess like there is a sense where it's not really the website's fault. Like it's just the compendium, but the use of the website can be very misused. Like the truth is that a trope is and always has been what you make of it in the moment, right? No story is entirely original. There has never been an original story. In the end, once you break down stories that you think are very original, you realize that they're actually like using the same thing. One of the best examples I remember, it was a conversation, I believe, on John's blog. This is from years ago. Things stick in my head. Yeah. This is one of them. It was a conversation about Spirited Away. Somebody mentioned that Miyazaki's Spirited Away was the most original movie that they had ever seen. And then somebody else responded to him and goes, I'm sorry, what? It's like, no, it's a great movie. Like, I'm not disagreeing about the quality, but it's like ordering number 4 on the Fairy World takeout menu. And what struck me about this was that both of them, I think, were actually entirely right. Because on one hand, it's like, if you look at Studio Ghibli, if you look at the basic plot structure of Spirited Away, not only was it not original, Studio Ghibli had released a movie with the same basic plot structure that same year, The Cat Returns. Girl gets trapped in the spirit world, needs to escape. Right? Like, that plot idea, that structure of what somebody getting trapped in and needing to escape the spirit world by learning the rules, is entirely unoriginal. And again, not only is it unoriginal, Studio Ghibli had made that same movie in the same year
themselves.
But on the flip side, like, anybody who has seen Spirited Away will tell you immediately that's one of the most imaginative works of fiction ever created, arguably, at least. It's
I think you're right on both points. So just to go back to the TV tropes thing. Yeah, I always try to, before I complain about the TV tropes, which I have some strong complaints, I always say it's nothing against the website, nor am I saying it couldn't be used well. My only complaint is, I think when you make too much of the tropes are like, it would be as if people went around saying, well, I don't want to use the same blueprint any other house used when I have my house built. Even if you have, like, let's say 5 or 10 basic blueprints, and each of the houses you make look quite different because you change where the staircase is and you change what the outside, you know what I mean? But so the tropes are like they're the places you get to naturally if you start trying to make something more dramatic. It's just the case that it's more dramatic to rescue a princess than to rescue a random girl. It's more dramatic for a goose girl who is the lowest of the low to fall to be marry a prince than it is for a merchant's daughter. And these things, they're more dramatic by the nature of the fact that overcoming a larger distance is overcoming a larger distance. So when people get too concerned about tropes, they start sacrificing what makes the story interesting. I think it's much better to do like what you were saying with Spirited Away. Let's take something. It's a basic fairy tale story. We've seen the basic idea 1,000 times, but let's make it different. This one has, a beautiful Japanese bathhouse and your mom is a pig. And I mean, it's a really beautiful story, and it's not quite like anything else. I mean, how many, train running under the water and all these other cool things. That's what makes its heart. It wouldn't be as good if they'd gone, oh, gee, other people have done a girl who gets stuck in fairyland. Let's not do that,
Yeah.
So that's why I think one has to be careful. You don't want to just do the trope the way everyone else does it. You want to rethink it. You want to try to make it your own, make it fit in your story. Even maybe give a twist. But a twist isn't ignoring it. A twist is just finding another way to make it dramatic.
Yeah, I agree with that, because one of the things, like, I understand that your husband wrote the wonderful, what was it, The Last Straw? All about the Last Jedi. I read that series when it came out on his blog, and I got the book after it came out. So I think, though, you could sum up, like, what's the main problem with The Last Jedi? And people go, oh, there's so many problems. Right, there are, but I would argue that they stem from a root cause, and that it becomes very clear when you even hear Rian Johnson, the director, speak about it. The root cause of the issues in The Last Jedi is that it is subversive for no reason except that it wants to be subversive. Right?
Exactly.
Like, it cannot give any reason for like subversion is not inherent. Let's put it another way. Subversion is not inherently bad. Absolutely not. I'm not even against experimentation with a reason, right? If you if you can articulate to me, and sometimes it will work and sometimes it won't. But even then, like, even if it doesn't, if you can articulate to me why you're doing it, I can at least respect the attempt. Last Jedi cannot. It cannot articulate why it's doing it, except for the fact that to do it the other way would be expected, which is nonsense. That's not a real reason at all.
The original video for the original Art and Craft of Writing, if you go to the Kickstarter, maybe you guys can put the link in the notes. There's a link to a free version of that video. And one of the things I talk about in that video is I'm like, imagine a story is like a landscape, the landscape of the heart, the landscape of the human soul. And it's like water running over the landscape. So there's lots of things you can do with the water. You can have it go straight. You can have it split. You can have it go in a waterfall. You can have it go underground and come up again. You can shoot it off a spout, that it suddenly comes out of the ground. So it goes in a completely different direction than you expected. But if you take a waterfall and you stick it in the middle of the ocean falling out of nowhere, the reader, the viewer is going to know that's not right. I mean, you could do it if it's one piece and then explain that there's a reason that's happening. But then you're putting in a reason. What it looks like Johnson did was he tried to just have random story elements with no reasons. And that is what we call a dream. The difference between a story and what happens to us at night is at night, you walk into a room and you talk to your friend, and then you walk into another room and there's a horse and you're horseback riding, and then you go down a slide, and there's no relationship between the first scene and the third scene. And that was kind of how he made his movie. It's the exact opposite of setting things up. You can set things up so that they go in a way you totally didn't expect, but you have to do the work of setting it up. He deliberately just didn't do what he'd set up, producing a kind of a mush.
Yeah, it reminds me of my all-time favorite book on writing is called How Not to Write a Novel. Absolutely hilarious. I highly, highly, highly recommend it to everyone. And one of my favorite sections of the book, it wasn't a full chapter, it was a little article in the middle of one of their chapters. They have like chapters like how not to write dialogue, and then they will give examples because they're editors, the writers, and they would give examples of bad dialogue, exaggerated. And one of my favorite sections of the book was a little article in the middle of one of the chapters called Why Your Job is Harder Than God's. And the point of the article was God can do anything because it really happened. It's just how it works, right? Oh, like you're saying that you crashed into a car and got struck by lightning and a boulder fell on you at the same time. Well, if it's on camera and you have witnesses, I guess that just happened. But if you write that in,
bad. Try to imagine you were an author and you were going to write that the richest man in the world was also a mad scientist, could make a robot car, could catch a plane, a spaceship, and he decides to audit the government. No author could get away from that with that. God can do it, but if we did it, everyone would tell us it was just a Gary Sue story, and they wouldn't believe it. We were talking about that yesterday.
Yeah, Why Your Job is Harder Than God's. How Not to Write a Novel. Wonderful, wonderful book. I highly recommend it. But yeah, it's interesting. The talk of tropes is so interesting because it's something that we've had these discussions in the past, and it's always, we had this discussion once we were talking about the movie Alien. The Sigourney Weaver, right? Good movie, excellent. So one of the interesting things about that movie that we were having a conversation about is the protagonist. So the protagonist of Alien is Ellen Ripley. And one thing you learn when you read about Alien is that the screenwriter claims that they really didn't want Ripley to be a woman. They wanted Ripley to be a man. And they only turned Ripley into a woman because the producer one of the producers basically read the script and said, dude, you really should make the main character a woman. And like, it wasn't that big of a deal to the writer, so they just said fine. They said, to be honest, when they asked him about it, this is what's so interesting to me. He says, to be honest, I wanted it to be a man. Why? Because this sort of character is always a woman. Now, having watched Alien relatively recently for the first time, like earlier or late last year, right? I watched Alien for the first time. And my reaction upon finishing the movie was the producer was absolutely right. Ellen Ripley had to be a woman. Or at the very least, the movie would have been significantly worse because she fits a trope. The trope is the final girl. The reason it's the final girl is intentional. It can't be the final guy. It can't be like the final, random engineer. The final scene of Alien works because Ellen Ripley is supposed to be a particularly vulnerable person in that moment.
Right.
Now,
right.
And the more vulnerable of the two sexes is female. That's why it's the final girl. That's why horror has evolved for it to end up as not the final person or the final guy, but very specifically the final girl. And Ellen Ripley fits in that trope.
Go ahead.
The producer's instinct was correct. They said, no, what you've written was the final girl trope. It has to be a final girl. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It will feel off. And he was right.
I bet you could make it, if you wanted to make it a male, you'd have to make it a little kid. Because the whole point is the character has to be vulnerable. So, you have to look for the character who's the most vulnerable. You might be able to make it a guy who is in a wheelchair or a little kid, but a girl is a really quick and easy way to get that across. And one of the things that I think the critics who talk about these things don't realize is books are amazingly short. The amount of stuff you can get into one is always less than you think it's going to be. And one of the things you need is to get, and a movie even more so, movie is about the length of a short story. You need to get certain things across quickly. Well, a vulnerable girl gets across the idea, okay, the tough guys have been taken out. Now we have the vulnerable person really quickly, and a lot of the times when they want you to do something other than what the trope is, it's a thing that you might be able to get away with if you had, 1,000 pages to work with. But if you're trying to do it in, an hour and a half, the whole point of a stereotype is it's something we all understand quickly. It's like shorthand. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if the only time stereotypes are a bad thing is if you judge a real person to have a negative quality, or even a positive quality, but usually a negative quality that they don't have just because they fit in a stereotype. But if you're talking about like a secondary character in a movie, if you want to use the stereotypes because it gives the viewer an instant understanding who the character is, then you can change him up a little bit, give the guy a different accent or have him have an unusual opinion. But, if you stop using stereotypes, you're stuck having to do everything from scratch. And it's kind of weird that the same group that complains about stereotypes seems to make its characters all stereotypes. Like all the female characters have to be, representing women, and what I mean. It's kind of weird. It's kind of backwards. But yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Let's not think of them too hard. Their hour is over for 4 years. We have a state
I
of
certainly
execution.
hope so. I certainly hope so.
Let's focus in a bit more on the Kickstarter at this point.
Sure.
I agree with you on all the things you said with TV tropes. TV tropes is like looking at a set a guidebook for a town. Here's the this town has a restaurant, this town has a monument, this town has a library. It's very nice, built by Carnegie, et cetera, et cetera. But the cooking of it, is of course completely different than the understanding of the ingredients.
I think I can sum up the problem. The only problem with TV tropes is if either the writer or the audience starts not following and enjoying the story, but just in their mind going, that's the rescue TV, that's the rescue trope, that's the this trope. if they stop understanding that the trope is like a blueprint and start mocking or collapsing the story into tropes,
Yes.
then you get things like in Moana, where Disney felt like they had to stop to explain why a trope was that way or something, which really would make the movie a little uncomfortable. You
I
know?
believe it. Yes, absolutely. Not that I've seen Moana. I just know the 2 songs. What can I say except
The
you
songs are
welcome?
good. I'm not complaining about the songs, but there were just
Yeah.
a number of little spots where they kind of like turned like they were turning to the audience to explain why something was that way. And you know it was because they were responding to complaints of people online. And I'm like, just tell your story. Don't do this. This is really awkward, you know?
Walt Disney would never.
There was one they did
did.
one that was hilarious. And it was hilarious because it was in the story. The others, like they were stopping and almost talking to the camera. But the funny one was when the girl is talking to the chicken, and the chicken is not a talking chicken. And finally she pauses and says, you know, but I don't remember if she said, but you don't know, but you don't something or other, because you're a chicken. And that was funny because it was her in character having that reaction, you say. But
Yes.
some of the others, and when I'd seen the movie, I could remember them. Now it's been a couple of years. I don't remember offhand, but I just remember there were a number of places where it just was really awkward. I'm like, just tell the story. Don't apologize for the story in the story, you know?
Oh, yes. So when I see guides like these, like what you're offering with the art and craft of writing romance, there tends to be 2 like major types of writing guides or classes or whatever. There's how to write and don't you know what the famous people do. And of course, I do not care one bit what Stephen King did because I don't have access to the amount of cocaine he used to have. So it's how would you describe, when the reader watcher,
This applies to both the romance and the original art and craft of writing. These all came from 2 different things. One was that John and I used to write down little when we'd learned something when we were writing, we'd write it down to remind ourselves as little writing tips. And I then eventually began to find that when I shared the writing tips with other writers, they really thanked me for it. So at one point in my life, I wrote an article about each of the writing tips, and basically that's the art and craft of writing. Half of it. The other half was when I started editing, I started finding that I was telling people the same information over and over again. So I wrote up as lessons some of the examples I'd given some of the writers and some of the, so that, okay, this seems to be a problem a lot of writers have. But I based the whole approach on Donald Moss's writing the Breakout novel, which is still my favorite writing book. And Moss wrote his book. Donald Moss, if you don't know, was a agent. And he was really big in science fiction and fantasy field. He used to be at all the conventions when I was younger and stuff like that. And he was one of the big agents in New York. And he decided one day he wanted to know whether he says there's 2 kinds of books. There's a book that gets to be big because people put a lot of advertising in it. And then there's a breakout novel. A breakout novel is one that sells a lot better than we expect, but not because of anything we did. So he said, I want to read 100 breakout novels, and I want to see. So these are all novels that they're not like they might look really big now, but they weren't really big when they came out. They were either brand new authors or they were authors who had always sold 5,000 books. And then suddenly this book comes out and it sells 25,000 books. So the author broke out of the circle they were in for sales. And after that, and he was comparing it with the thousands of over the transom slush pile books he'd gotten. Well, he concluded that they were better, that they were much better than the slush pile books. And then he wrote this book analyzing why they were better. And I really liked his approach because it was very, I want to use the word logical, but I'm not sure that's exactly the right thing. He really broke down exactly what the books did in a way, like I had read dozens of writing books, and nearly every one, some of them I enjoyed, some of them I didn't. I learned that if you're a writing teacher, you probably write a better writing book than if you're just a writer, because people who wrote but had never taught just told what they did, while people who had taught writing knew that things work differently, and some authors do well with outlines and some don't, or they were a little more flexible. But most of the time I would read these books either by an author or by a teacher, and I would go, okay, yes, I do understand that you're saying a thing that would be good to do. I have no idea how to do that. And Moss just tells you how to do it. So I wanted to do a book like that, a book that was practical and helpful, that had exercises that would help you do these things. They might be something you need. They might not be something you need, but at least you can go away with a practical step forward. Like if I get stuck in a novel, I'll still pull out Donald Moss's workbook and try one of his exercises. And often that'll be the thing I need to move forward. That was what was missing. So that was my approach for the original one. And the romance one is basically similar. It's kind of breaking down, study of what I've seen about how in writing romance, you get various effects, some of it's the effects you'd want for actual romance, where you're trying to get that oogly boogly feeling where the girl's eyes are half closed and she's going, oh. And some of it's just about the plotting of how to, you need obstacles in the way so that one of the great insights I had the first time I tried to write a romance many, many years ago is romances can never be about romance. You can't be about the guy coming to the girl, because they have to be in a framework. The romance is always the second string of she's going to London, or he's a pirate, or whatever it is that the plot is about, that the character has to be heading one way, like a skater, where you skate with kind of at a V. If you put your feet, I don't know if you guys skate, but if you try to skate going straight forward like new kids always do when they get at the skating rink, you just go backwards. Yeah, you have to angle your feet slightly, and they move away from each other slightly, and that gives you the motion that moves forward. Well, the same thing's true with romance. There has to be something the character's trying to do other than the romance, for the romance to trip up and get in the way of and lead them to where they really need to be. And I just tried to kind of analyze these things and give some exercises. And we made these fun videos with the first crowdfunding campaign some years ago. Unfortunately, our publisher went out of business, and our second publisher went out of business. So right now I'm giving them away for free to homeschoolers, but at some point we'll do something else with them. But we are, so when I ran into Ken and Ken and Ben, Ken Dixon is the narrator. He does such a good job. And you can hear him in the little test bit up on the Kickstarter website. And then Ben Zwiski does our videographing. And you can see his work in the two examples that are there, one that you link to and one on the site. And so we thought, it'd be really fun to make videos for this to go along, because it's just a little easier to take it all in when someone's reading it and you're looking at the graphics that kind of reinforce it a bit, I think, than just reading it. I mean, not that, we'll put out a little ebook for it too, but so that's what it is. It's just kind of helping a person try to make their, a few more obstacles of the kind that are going to help the story, bring out the quality of how, what do they have in common? What can hold them apart? And it's not that different from, just general writing advice, but it's specific to trying to pull out these things. And then I do talk about, as I said, the difference between the needs of culture and the needs of drama, which is, what's dramatic in a romance is not necessarily one of the basic things about basic romance. I mean, the actual genre is a lot of the time the guy who makes a good romance hero is not someone you would want to marry, nor would you want your sister to marry them. Okay. And one of the first things that we're looking at here is the difference between what's dramatic and what, a culture would be. Well, what kind of guy do you want someone, to marry? Okay, well, let's have a story like that. There's an author that I do rather like who writes stories that are, she's a Christian author, and her stories, the guys are just kind of ordinary guys. They're not super masculine like most romance characters. And I think that almost needs a different word. I mean, it's an enjoyable book, but it doesn't produce the emotion that you go to read a romance novel for. It produces a slightly different emotion. I almost think one of them should be called a love story and the other a romance or something like that. But hopefully the advice given in this little videos that we're trying to make is useful for both. It's useful both if you want to write an actual category romance type story that has some of the tropes and things that a person who wants that kind of story is looking for, and if you want to write any kind of story, but you want to slip in a bit of a romance, so like what points you need to hit to make, Jack and Jill are on a spaceship together, and this is mainly about the spaceship is failing, and they're trying to make it to a planet before they die. But you also want to have, the right kind of tensions and pulling together to make the captain and the girl who's in charge of trying to keep the plants alive so you can eat, fall in love with each other or whatever, something like that.
Right. It's like what you said with the two string. That's the reason why all Hallmark movies are fundamentally about the girl trying to, rediscover herself and then finding the lonely hunk who works the coffee shop. Or has a zoo, or whatever the product we have.
He would almost never work at the coffee shop. You know what? You talk about the zoo. No, the zoo is good. It's like the tropes thing where I say that what you do with tropes is you take the basic idea and then you try to imagine what if it was more that way. You always want something that seems impressive to a girl. Well, what seems impressive to a girl? Okay, well, if the guy is doing something interesting that's independent, like running a zoo or a Christmas tree farm, or he fights bears or something. I don't know. It hits one of those points that is just going to be more interesting than if he's just, if he's working at the coffee shop, he has to also have a horse farm that's failing that he's trying to save. You know what I mean? So
right.
But that's the kind of thing we're talking about. We're talking about finding those points. And the Hallmark movies do it really well. I mean, they're most of them are pretty, what my dad would call kitschy. And, but it's always the same thing, that the girl lives in a modern world where she is not really taking any time to be herself. And she goes into a slower world where there's a guy who's much more rugged or individualistic than the lawyer she's dating. She realizes she likes this world better. I mean, that's like nearly every one of them,
Well, there's a cheap gag. You mentioned fighting bears. She's from LA, so she gasps in horror, and then she has a completely different idea about what kind of bears he's fighting. And then the whole romance is basically convincing her that he has nothing to do with an LA bear and everything to do with the grizzly bears attacking his farm.
Right. Exactly.
It writes itself, I swear.
Yes.
So you've got the ebook, you've got the classes. Let's talk a little bit more about the classes, the lessons for a second. What are I know Anthony took it. I think I took it. Probably. I have vague memories of it. One.
So I think you took one of the earlier ones. Anthony actually took the romance one. I'm not sure you were there for that.
I probably wasn't. You have to understand, I've changed Anthony's life several times, and I can't remember a single time.
It's all right.
So, why don't
It's
you
true.
tell us? It's true. Why don't you tell us a little bit about like what a person, if they buy the lessons, what they can expect from the lessons?
Okay, so right now we're just trying to make 3 lessons. if it funds and we go a little further, I was hoping to do 5 or 6, but we'll see. We're just starting small. I haven't done. I had done a Indiegogo, but this is my first time doing a Kickstarter, and it's 5 years since we did anything. So I got advice from a friend who runs them all the time, and one of her points of advice was to start asking for just the smallest amount you actually need to do it. So we started with 3, but it covers things like romance requires taboo. I'm taboo obstacles, however you want to look at it. But this is why historical romances are so popular, because the things that get in the way of them coming together are just built in. If you write a modern romance where people are allowed to just jump in bed the first time they go on a date, you need to kind of jump through a lot more hoops to make up why they don't come together right away than you do if they live in 18th century, 19th century London and they're never allowed to go anywhere without a chaperone. I mean, one of them is just easier as far as the basic setup. So that's one reason that the historical ones are really popular. Then the second, so that's one of the issues. Second issue is resisting the lure. As I put it here, why him being too into her won't produce a good romance, and other secrets of adding spark to romance. So if you get your characters, if they're interested in each other too quickly, or they commit too quickly, or they can come together too quickly, you might end up with a good love story, but you won't be a good romance in the sense that I was saying of the trying to produce. There's three romance emotions. The 3 romance emotions, and that's the third thing, catch the lightning, oogly boogly feeling, heartbreak, and zing. So the 3 emotions that women go to read romances for are that oogly boogly feeling, that feeling that you get when there's no other word for it, so it's the word that was being used, when they're attracted to each other. And this usually happens as the guy's is being presented in a way that's attractive to the girl and vice versa. The heartbreak is another thing that people read romances for. And the angst and in fact, there are famous books where the angst and heartbreak is practically the only point, and they don't always end happily. They're not like romances in the categorical style, but there are love stories with romance in it. And so one of the things, like I remember as a younger person when I would read romances, which was my go-to kick around. I don't have to work today. I don't want to have to think about writing fantasy, because when I read a fantasy, I think about it. I would kick back and read a romance. And after a while, I just would skip the sex scenes because they're kind of boring. And I would look for the places where they're arguing or there's heartbreak. The heartbreak is caused by the tension of the 2 of them not being able to get to each other or misunderstanding each other. And some misunderstandings in romances are dumb, but it can be done really well. I just read one where the misunderstandings between them were really solid. Like their worldviews were so different. The guy married the girl because he wanted a wife of a higher station. She was poor, but from a higher station. She had learned to cook because she had to provide for her father, who was dying on a small amount of money. She was really proud of the fact she'd learned to cook. The guy was horrified that she would cook because he'd married her to have a wife who was a lady. And things like that, there's no easy answer. It's not like, I didn't tell him that I was, putting his socks out, and then he found the socks. He didn't know it was me. And now, there's a lot of these things have really stupid misunderstandings. But that one was not a stupid one. That was a really basic misunderstanding where it was really hard to overcome because it had to do with and the guy never did come around to liking the idea that she was cooking. And then the last one is zing. So zing is the emotion that you get at the moment when the relationship takes a step closer. in romances, you could actually break down the first time they see each other, the first time they actually become aware of each other, the first time they become aware the other guy's aware of them, the first time they become aware that they're thinking about the other person, the first time that one of them realizes they're in love with the other person, the first time they realize they're both in love with the other person, the first kiss, etc. So each of these points, most romances only hit a few of them. Nobody really hits them all. But every time you hit one, if you nail it, if you go out of your way to actually put it on stage, the reader, if they're a reader who likes romance, gets this little zing feeling like, oh my gosh. So much so that I remember as a young girl having certain books where I would just read like the one scene over and over again. It had the greatest zing in it. In fact, my favorite scene in War and Peace is one where one guy is watching a guy and a girl he likes, but he's married, so he can't really, pursue her. And the guy is his best friend, and they are noticing each other. And the author tells it by, he comes in and he can't understand why the girl looks so bad, because she looked really pretty when he saw her a few days ago. And then he looks over and she's entirely changed and she looks really beautiful. And then he looks and she's looking at his friend and they're talking. It's just so well done. I've read that scene so many times because it has perfect zing. It's like the perfect zing scene. But those are the kind of things that make romances really enjoyable as far as qua romance. And even a book that's like War and Peace, or there was a moment like that in one of the Dragon Rider books by Anne McCaffrey that I read a lot when I was a kid. I mean, I read that one paragraph over like 20 times over the years. It doesn't have to be a book about romance, but you hit that zing moment when they notice each other or that something changes in their relationship. And that tends to delight the reader, particularly the readers who are fond of romance. I assume readers who are not fond of romance probably kind of vaguely enjoy the moment, but they probably don't really think about it a lot.
Yeah, I've realized myself over time when it comes to romance, like, you ask younger Anthony and he would have told you that he didn't really like romance because, I'm a guy, like I just don't. Right. And that, not even in a machismo way, just like, I guess I'm just like most guys, right? Like, but over the years, as I've thought it over, I'm like, I wouldn't read a romance novel. I wouldn't go out of, or at least I wouldn't go out of my way to seek it unless somebody like, grabbed me by the shoulders who I really trusted and said, no, you got to read this book. Right.
Yeah.
Like say, Iron Chamber of Memory actually is a good example of that. But
it's a romance, though it's also kind of just an eerie fantasy. I mean, the romance seems to be what's going on, but it almost kind of isn't. But yeah, it's a fine example.
Yeah, so the point being, though, I've realized over time that actually I do like romance quite a bit, but romance works excellently, and I think I got this from you, though I don't remember if I'm 100% sure of this. I got it from somewhere. Romance works excellently as a flavor, right?
Yeah.
Like as a secondary plot line. Like one of my all-time favorite lines in any movie, and it's no surprise, it's everybody's favorite line, so I'm not special for thinking this, but it's from The Empire Strikes Back, right?
Yeah.
And, everybody knows the line when he goes, I love you, I know.
I know. Oh,
amazing line.
When I was young,
amazing line.
So horrified. That was like my worst nightmare was to have that happen. And because of that, of course, it's just a super, super good line. Yes. I think you're right. In my experience, I can tell you my experience as a role-playing person. I've gotten some of the guys I know to play in games where romance was the main thing happening for years before they realized that was what was going on. I mean, that we wasn't doing it on purpose. It just happened to be that way. But because, of course, the romance is presented in a game as a problem you have to solve, So they were really interested in it when it was their life, their problem they had to solve. But it also wasn't the main issue. It was, I would say, I think romance is almost like glue. There's a lot of long series, either television or books, where whether or not these two guys are going to get together is like the glue that makes you, when the next one comes out, you go, oh yeah, I wanted to find out if they were going to get together. I think I'll read that. And you don't read it for the romance because it's a mystery, let's say, you read it for the mystery.
Yep.
But the
TV shows are amazing with this. They love like cop shows with a female male lead.
Right.
Castle Bones or off the top of my head.
Exactly. And I remember I realized this one time quite some years ago with Dresden. I was like, I forget which character it was that I was wondering if he would get together with or not. And I realized like that was what made me pick the book up again, because I hadn't thought about it since some years since the previous one. But I didn't think about it really when I was reading it. I wasn't reading it for the romance, but just the question of the unfinished question, was a question that made me want to, I want to know what happens with that. Well, they do the same thing as you say with cop shows, because usually the mystery question has to be finished within the hour. Occasionally they can have an ongoing plot that ends at the end of the season or something like that. But the romance question, will they or won't they, can go on for seasons at a time.
Yeah, exactly. There's also examples like one of my favorite books is Around the World in 80 Days, right? And Around the World in 80 Days is very clever, the way that it in my opinion at least, the way that it utilizes its romance is very clever. What it does is it has its main plot, right? Phileas Fogg needs to make it around the world in 80 days. And they set it up at the beginning. And then at one point in the first third of the story, relatively early on, Phileas Fogg makes a small delay in order to rescue a woman named Ayuda from being sacrificed to an Indian goddess. Which, by the way, for the record, I have researched this. That is absolutely historically accurate. I've seen SJWs, especially like in the modern day, people despise this, and they are wrong to. That was real. It did happen, and it was the British who put a stop to it.
Yes, in fact, there's a famous
Jules Verne was 100
line. I don't know if you know this. The famous line, the British line. You keep talking. I'll see if I can.
Yeah, I know what you're thinking of. I think the one where it's like, oh, it's our policy to stop you from burning widows on tires.
I believe it's your culture to burn widows, and it's our culture to kill you if you do it, is basically the line.
Yeah. Granted, it is kind of funny that Ayuda is canonically an Indian princess, but Jules Verne went out of his way to make her the most British Indian princess he possibly could. From her appearance to her education and her upbringing. It's like she is technically Indian, but she looks white and she acts white and she was raised in Britain, so it's okay. It's cool.
Well,
but whatever.
It lets him both make her exotic and familiar
match
to the readers who at the time may not have been as open to exotic things.
Yeah, a mixed race romance.
It's kind of clever almost. It gives you the kind of the best of both worlds.
Oh yeah, no, it's just kind of funny how when you reread it, it's very transparent because he has a long description of like, actually, she's basically just a white person. It's pretty funny, but whatever. This is neither here nor there. I love Ayuda. I love the whole plot line. One of the clever things that Jules Verne does is by the end of the book, Phileas Fogg's entire thing is that he has used half his fortune and bet the other half, which means when it ends, he literally has the exact same amount of money as he started with. So what does that mean? What's the point of the book? And then Jules Verne literally reveals it on the very last page where he goes, well, he married Ayuda.
Yeah.
And then he's like, and then he says in one of my favorite lines ever, really, he goes, and wouldn't you make a trip around the world for the same reason? And that's how the novel ends. It's very cleverly done.
Oh, that's really cute. I read it so long ago. I was quite young. I don't remember the end at all, but that's really delightful.
Oh, it's a book. It's one of those books that I regularly reread. It's so easy to pick up. It's so easy to pick up and read. It's also very un-Vern-like in a lot of ways, because unlike Vern's other stuff, it is in fact like meticulously accurate. Every single thing in that book, I've read several like articles and people talking about it. Everything in that book that happens could in fact have happened. Like, it's all plausible.
John in the background says it's also one of the very few Vern books that has any kind of romance in it. That most of his books did not.
It's true.
Yeah. And it's a very clever way of using the romance, because I feel like you're reading the book wondering what the point is, and then Jules Verne kind of reveals to you at the end, well, in a way, this was the point all along, whether you noticed it or not, right?
That is really
and
cute.
who's really going to argue with him?
Yeah, that's adorable.
So, yeah, I think that romance... the reason I bring all of this up is to say that I think your course is going to be very useful for people, even if you're like, well, I'm not going to write a romance. Well, sure, most people aren't, to be honest, but you might want to write a romance in your work, like not a romance novel, but you might want to have a romance in your story, and it's generally a very good idea. It adds a lot to the story. You can create, if you have a long-running series, it creates intrigue. If you want to have a through line in the background, like Jules Verne uses, that can provide a sort of structure to your ending, it's really good. The Empire Strikes Back uses it to absolutely brilliant effect.
Yes.
And there's a lot of different examples of this, that learning how to do it well is going to be useful for you, even if you're not a romance writer. Right now I'm not writing a romance. I am the Orpheus and Eurydice, but I mean the current thing that's coming out that I'm writing, which is Pinkerton's Ghosts. Is not a romance, but romance is a major part of my character. This was a conscious choice I made. I even remember like telling Ben this at the time, being like, I want to add a romance to my plot line, because I feel like it's part of it was that my character of the three detectives in our Pinkerton's Ghost supernatural mystery thing is the most human of the three characters. Like, he's the least fit to be a occult detective. And in making him the most human, I wanted to give him like a human subplot, which is he has a romance, right? Just a normal romance with a normal person, like nothing strange or weird or anything like that. And that has taken up like quite a bit of time and quite a bit of energy in like setting up the romance and figuring out how to develop it properly, but in the background of this long running series is very interesting, because the way that Pinkerton's Ghost works too, it's kind of like those long-running cop shows, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Where you have these episodic
in fact,
stories.
It's very much like that. It's kind of noir, occult, cop mystery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like honestly, people have compared it to Supernatural, and they are right to. It's like Supernatural, but better.
I think you summed up really well my idea when I put this together, which is, there are a lot of people who write romance, and I'm kind of writing to them, but I'm also just as much writing to anyone who wants to use this kind of thing to bring people together. And I'll say, you can even, romance is itself extremely, useful, important type of part of life, which I'll make a comment about in just a moment. But you could even use a similar idea for any other type of friendship or family relationship if your point was that these two people are not getting along and then we want them to get along. You wouldn't have the romantic zing to it, but you could still have, some of it. But now I forgot the point. I was going to make the point. I said I was going to make it. Now I can't remember what it was. Something. It'll come back to me in a moment. You talk until I remember what it was.
Sure.
I think,
go ahead.
Speaking of the zing, that there is a moment where there's a switch, that soft mood lighting, the music swells, they lean in for the kiss or something like that. Because
that's a perfect example of a zing moment. The moment of a first kiss is one of the really strong ones.
Oh yeah. Well, it's how do I want, like, It's not as I know what I want to say, but it's like for people who, shall we say, haven't experienced the depths, of romance and stuff like that, or have very few examples in their lives of it. It's actually very interesting to see it in other people. Because
Yeah.
if you people watch in a college or something like that, you can see these things happen in real time, or in a high school.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. I remember what I was going to say. One of the things that we mentioned Moana earlier, one of the things that actually convinced me about the importance of romance was the movie Moana. And it's because it doesn't have one.
Yeah,
But not just doesn't have one. Moana is a movie where there is a tribe, and the tribe has a rock for each tribal chief or leader. And Moana's dad is the chief, and there's a scene where Moana gets to put her rock, or is going to be able to put her rock up on top of this pile of growing rocks from, who knows how, ever since the tribe was started. And I looked at it and I thought, there's never going to be another rock on that pile if Moana doesn't get married and have a kid. And put aside the fact that she could have a niece or something. Let's just, look at it from the direct point of view. Romance, I suddenly realized, is actually really important. It's much more important than a lot of other types of things because it affects the future. It not only affects what the next kid who puts the rock on is going to be like, but it affects generations down the line that you exist, that you have certain qualities because your great, 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 great grandfather got married, And I realized that we tend to see it as frivolous because it's often written as frivolous, but it's actually something really important. About the same time, I listened to a video about the 18th century marriage mart, and it became clear that in order to marry their children well, which they're hoping to do so that they will be taken care of, and not that everybody worked, some of the, didn't work out, but, in order to try to provide for them, it was a full-time job. So here we are in our culture, and we've stripped out we've removed the load-bearing posters from, as they say in The Simpsons, from everything that brings people together to find a mate, so that most of the things that would normally help you are not there, and it's just a much harder thing for people to do, and I have a lot of friends who, even in their 50s haven't found anybody, and a bunch of friends who got married in their 50s for the first time. So it's happened to at least 7 or 8 people I know. But they shouldn't have to wait that long. But we've undercut everything that used to be there, and we mock it. Everything they used to do to try to arrange for a good marriage, nowadays we mock. And when I looked at the Moana thing, I realized, sometimes you have a story about saving the world. That's pretty important. But honestly, a lot of the time, who the person marries is going to have a much more long-term effect on the world than whether or not they solve whatever the local plot issue is, And it's just occurred to me it was just much more important than we were giving it credit for. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody wants to read a romance per se. That's, it's any more than everybody wants to read a mystery, or everybody wants to read a thriller or a sports story. It's a matter of taste. But it's something that we need more respect for. If we're talking about the needs of culture, one of the things our culture needs is more respect for people getting together and getting married. And so that's one of the things that you can touch on in your stories if you're adding romance without having to give it any sort of preachiness, You don't need to say any of what I just said. You just bring them together and make it enjoyable,
Yeah, I think there is a difference though between a romance and something like a sports story, say, or I'm thinking of anime genres now, or a shonen action story, right? The difference, I think, is that unlike these other stories, romance can and does slot very easily into these stories.
Right.
Right. Like,
you have a sports story, but the guy's girlfriend is mad at him because he went to practice when he was supposed to go take her to the ball or whatever. You know what I mean? It's really easy to make romance the second string for nearly anything, like what you were saying about your Pinkerton thing. It fits in really well as an opposing plotline because whatever the main thing is going to easily get in the way of the romance. So it makes it really easy.
Yeah.
You know?
I think so shonen are kind of notorious for having like doing their romances, in my opinion, sometimes a little bit too lightly with too light of a touch, because the philosophy in Japan is that these are like, boys' action stories.
Yeah, I know in One Piece, the guy
boys
just
don't
decided
care
he
as
was
much.
never going to have a romance, which I actually think was a mistake because if you talk to other One Piece fans, I would say about 45% of the time they talk about, well, is this guy really going to get together with this guy, or who's this guy going to end up with? Because he does the kind of thing where you think that at the end he's going to show 10 years later. You know what I mean? So they're clearly interested
I will
in it,
say,
Now,
but he
I have
doesn't spend
opinions
any
about
time on it. But in a lot of the others, I think you're right. They do touch on it, but as you say, so lightly that it's almost too lightly.
I have some opinions about this because it's how do I want to put it? It's like the romance of Romance Dawn, the first chapter of One Piece, isn't necessarily a romance in the
Right.
sense of
It's the old use of romance in the
Right.
sense of the romances used to mean pirate stories and highwaymen and stuff like that.
And the key I want to get at is that actually a good quote unquote romance of that definition does meet all the definitions of a romance with the what we would call a romance with the zing and two strings and everything like that. A boy runs away from home, meets a pirate who is not necessarily a let's murder and rape everyone in this port town pirate, but an actual he's on a quest to find his captain's buried treasure. Not
Right.
exactly Treasure Island, but I'm using similar tropes of Treasure
Right,
Island.
exactly. So
You have that. Sorry. Let me
go
just
ahead,
finish.
go ahead.
Like you have multiple zing points. Instead of the first kiss, it's seeing the pirate kill a traitorous mutinous dog in a vicious night fight. Instead of the fulfillment, the marriage in an English novel, you have discovering the buried treasure or rediscovering the lost ship. Like these things have
Right.
incredible parallels, which is why Jaji, I must vociferously and with everything I have deny that One Piece needs any sort of romance.
Well,
In the main character.
what I think is fascinating about about One Piece is that romance is one of my favorite things. I utterly love One Piece, and I don't even notice there's romance is missing. It took me several years to even realize it wasn't there. Usually, often I might not even like something if it didn't have a bit of romance, but with this one, it's just because you're right. What's the draw in it is the dream coming true, trying to get your dream to come true, and instead of it being a dream of love, it's a dream of adventure and trying to be recognized by people you admire as being worthy of them. And things like that. And so it has a lot of the beats of a romance, but I completely agree that it, I don't think it's needed within the story at all. I do hope that he does do a 10 years after thing at the end and show us where people go, because I think it's the kind of the depth of the story he has makes us want to see, like, what is there going to be another generation? But it's not needed in the story. But a lot of times they put it in the story, but maybe very lightly, just a little bit of it. But still, it does help pull things together if it's not too light. I mean, romances can be done really badly. I've read a number of stories written by men that were where the romance often seems to me really heavy-handed, or there's not enough keeping them apart, or they jump in bed too quickly, which kind of just cuts the interest. So it can be done poorly. And so part of the idea for these lessons are, well, here's some notes for how to do it in a way that hopefully will, get what you wanted to put in there anyway across in a way that will be more delightful to your reader than, if you did it a little more ham-fistedly.
Yeah, one of the things that one of the reasons I brought up anime and shonen and all of this was that an interesting thing about the way that the Japanese view romance is that it's not really considered a girl genre in the way that it is for America or the West. Like for example, Kaguya-sama Love is War is a rom-com.
Yeah.
It was, I think, for a while the most popular manga. Then Demon Slayer broke every record in the world and tripled the record, and then killed everything. But like for a while, it was the most popular manga in the world. Kaguya-sama Love is War made a pretty good anime out of it too. Kaguya-sama Love is War. Like my sister pointed this out to me. She's like, it's a shonen. Like it's not shoujo. Which is for people who don't know, that's the girls genre, right? It wasn't shoujo. It is a shonen.
Yeah.
Like a lot of there's actually a lot of romantic shonen.
Yeah.
Like
I think you're right.
If you read Shonen Jump, some of the most popular manga in the world are in Shonen Jump, meaning that they are for boys primarily. Obviously girls read it, but that's the primary audience. And they are romances. Like not adventure stories with romances, but romances first and foremost. Blue Box is the other one, which I've read like over 100 chapters of. It's not bad. It's like a sports story romance, but the romance is at least as important as the sports story. Like it's one of the main appeals of the story.
I would say the same thing was true for Orange Road. I mean, the relate.
Oh, no, I'm not aware of Orange Road.
Orange Kaga something where the Orange Road. It was one of the anime that was like the really, really big ones, maybe 20 years ago, and it was one of the first ones that came over here. At one point, everybody who watched anime would have seen it. But it was about a family of espers. They had psychic powers. But really, it was about the relationship between the main guy and these two girls, and one of the girls was like a thug girl, and one of the girls was like a sweet girl, and the two girls were friends, and the sweet girl fell in love with the guy, and the guy and the thug girl really liked each other, but the thug girl didn't want to get in the way of her friend, who the guy didn't want, so it was a love triangle between them. But it was also about hiding their magic powers and other things, but it really was about the relationship. And I think it's true that in anime, where there's also a visual component and sometimes there's also fighting or magic or something, that some of them were just basically romances. They're about the guy and the girl coming together. They're often done a little differently than the shoujo ones are, the girl ones are. But it's it's like when I said that, the games I ran where some of my guy friends realized they had basically been playing a romance, but there was also action and fighting and dragons to fight and whatever it was,
Yeah. From like a few years back, when I say a few, we now might be talking about close like a decade now, which is wild to think of. But there was a show that was originally a manga called Ancient Magus Bride.
Yeah.
If you were to watch Ancient Magus Bride, and if you were to read it, yeah, which is great, by the way. But your thought would immediately be this was probably a shoujo, and you would be wrong. It actually was absolutely not a shoujo. It was a shonen. And again, this isn't one of those things where it's like, well, technically, like, no, the way that this works is that you're in the magazine that's marketed towards this group.
Right,
it either is or isn't.
It was
it's like a little bit
beautiful,
pregnant.
But
it's gorgeous.
In a
I
way,
loved
it was a romance, but in a way, it was also about magic. Was also about just the relationship between the non-human being and the human being. I mean, there's a lot of other things going on than just a romance. But I think that one that's one of those things. I think it could go either way. You could have probably sold it to girls also. But it was interesting enough.
I've
That it
always
was also
considered
good for
Ancient
guys.
Magus Ride. Yeah, I've always considered it when I watched it. I thought of it as first and foremost a fantasy romance.
Yeah.
Like that's the way that I thought of it. Or maybe like a fantasy slice of life romance even.
Yeah.
Because it was so slow
first
paced. And
season. The second
I love it.
season, Don
Yeah.
and I never got through. I don't know. Half of it I loved, and half of it just didn't do that much for me. But the first season,
I don't think I ever watched the second season, but I loved the first season.
The first season
was awesome.
The first season takes place. You know where the first season takes place? It's in England. It's really beautiful. Blah blah
Yes.
blah. The second season takes place half at a magic school and half back in England. I mean, it's in England, but it's like in London versus out in the country. And the problem is with the magic school, it was like way too many characters. I couldn't quite tell what was going on. The magic school was not like interesting enough and so they'd have the magic school episodes and we'd be like, I don't think I want to watch anymore. And then they'd have an episode where they went back in the country and she ran into I forget what they called them. They had cousins or whatever the name they had for the different supernatural creatures. And they'd have to solve the kind of problem they did in the first season. And we'd be like, oh, this is great, And then they'd go back to the magic school.
Yeah.
One of the times they went back to the magic school, I just never went back and watched it. I mean, maybe it gets good after that. Hopefully someone will tell me someday. But it was kind of weird how the same thing when it was in
Oh, that's interesting. That's too bad.
Yeah, when it was
I watched the first season and I thought it was great. But
us too. John even played the Magus in a game once. We just thought it was just wonderful.
It's also, by the way, the sort of thing that I don't think you would be permitted to make in the West because it's about a non-human monster person buying a little girl, essentially, in order to groom her to be his bride.
I mean, there's a lot of things about it that are a bit uncomfortable, and it easily could have been awful, but it wasn't.
Yeah, but I think it's handled with a very, very delicate touch.
Yeah,
like it
really
acknowledged by everyone that what he's doing is really like, I think that's part of it, is that it's acknowledged by everyone that what he's doing is very strange. That the Magus himself, in not being human, he's willing to hear this out and be like, I'm not human. I don't know how this works, but I hear what you're all saying, so I'm not going to do anything until she's comfortable with it.
Right.
And the girl herself was like, one of the great things about Chise?
Yes, her name is really hard to say.
Yeah. Something like that. One of the great things about Chise, why she's such a compelling character, is that when he buys her, like, she's essentially, clinically depressed, like all but suicidal.
Well,
when he buys her.
One of the things that makes it work so well is that her life with him is so much better than her life without him was. You know what I mean? Okay, maybe he technically bought her, but he's really nice to her. He's a bit strange because he's alien and because he's a fairy creature and he doesn't really know how humans think, but he's nice to her and he cares about her, and she's never had that before. He doesn't care about her the way, a human might. It's a little different, but it's a lot more than she had in her life because she could see fairies and stuff. She was really badly mistreated by her family. And she could have been bought by somebody much, much worse when she was auctioned off as this fairy creature girl. So I think that's one of the things that makes it work, is that
I believe too
to him for the fact that he's making her life better.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. There's also I thought My Hero Academia recently ended. It's not that recent anymore, actually. We're getting I think we're close-ish to a year now. It's been, at the very least, been a strong few months, right?
Yeah.
He came out with the Horikoshi, then came out with he came out with his ending. The ending was, in my opinion, pretty good, even though it got a lot of hate for really strange reasons. Then he came out with like basically an epilogue in the volume release, like 60 new pages, where he fleshed it out, and I think that he made it even better. So I think it was an improvement. It gave the fans a lot of what they were hoping for. But one of the strange things about My Hero Academia, if you watch it, is that there is a romance that's a pretty big part of the show early on, right? Like Deku and Ochako, or Uraraka, depending on what you call her. So she's actually like, if you think about it for a moment, in like the context of the story, Ochako is actually like a really big part of Deku's life and motivation. Like his whole hero name, like people go, oh, he got it from Bakugo, which he did, but he also gets it from Ochako, in a kind of funny way, because it's like a girl said a nice thing to him once, so he made that his whole identity.
Yeah.
But it does kind of fit Deku's character at the time. It does kind of fit Deku's character at the time.
Yeah.
But it's kind of weird because My Hero Academia is very much more in the vein of like the One Piece style, where it's like, it's not a romance. It's not trying to be a romance.
Was quite light. You kind of knew, who was the girl that he kind of liked and stuff, but it was very light. It wasn't heavy.
That's why it was so weird to me when it ended. One of the things that people were mad about, and I sort of agree, but I also don't, which I'm going to mention. One of the things that people were mad about is that he didn't make a relationship between Deku and Ochako explicit, and people were annoyed by this.
Because they put in all this time waiting for it.
Yeah, on one hand, I do understand it, right? And that's one of the things, like, if you asked me to name things I was kind of disappointed about, I would have said that. Which, by the way, he does correct in the epilogue. They do officially get together.
Oh, good.
Which is one of the reasons the epilogue is so good.
Right.
But anyway, like, in the end, though, I was like, do I consider this a thing that breaks the story? Well, no, because to be honest with you, it was never that big a part of the story to begin with.
And they're so young, that if it... I like the idea of if he gets them to get together, there's a sense of completion. But even by the end of the story, they're still so young that you could just be left thinking, well, it could happen in the future,
Well, it's really weird because they have a 7-year time skip at the ending. But what's so odd about it is that people got so angry at the fact that there was this time skip. So I'm gonna spoil the end, but on the other hand, My Hero Academia really isn't the sort of story that can be spoiled. Like, Horikoshi did not end with the villain winning and Deku dying.
Right.
I think you all knew that, though.
Exactly.
It wasn't gonna happen that way. It's not that type of story. So Deku ends up losing One for All eventually. It just kind of fades out, like, which is, they told you would happen at the beginning, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
And this is what eventually happens. He has to give it up to defeat Shigaraki. He still has the embers for a bit and then eventually fades out. So we cut to 7 years in the future, and Deku is working as a teacher at UA. He's like a living legend. Children recognize him on sight and go, whoa, I didn't even know you were real. Because he becomes famous, which is great. I love it. But people were so angry at the fact that he's 7 years later and he says, oh, I'm having trouble keeping in touch with my friends because they're heroes and we all have different jobs occasionally. We don't really talk much. And then it says the end. He goes, and this is my life. I'm a teacher at UA. And then All Might smashes the words the end and says, no, it's not the end yet. It's pretty funny. And he goes, we got you this. And they give Deku a special super suit that they have spent the last 7 years designing that recreates the powers of One for All, that was funded by Class 1A. That they all got together and funded really it to give Deku
because he has the attitude. I mean, that's what we knew from the beginning when he didn't have a power. He has the right attitude to being a hero. He needs the ability to go out and do something. That's
right, really exactly.
That's
and then
really great.
He goes, I don't know if I can accept this, and All Might says you earned it, and then he rides and then he goes and responds to a call with the super suit. One of the weird things, though, is how people react to this. They were like, so Deku was just a chump for...
Why do you need it? Sorry.
Yeah. I know. The Incredibles is also worth talking about with romanticism. I probably will in a moment. But Yeah, one of the weird things about this ending was that everybody's reaction was like, so he just went 7 years as a loser and he was a chump and he didn't get the girl and all his friends became heroes. And I'm reading it and I'm like, where are you getting any of
Yeah,
this?
I mean,
None of
I
this
thought he was
is
a
in the
teacher.
story.
And being a teacher,
Yeah.
I when you said, "Oh, he's teaching," I thought, "Oh, that's actually really cool," you know? So, yeah, I think
Yeah,
you're
he's a
right.
teacher at UA.
But I think it's, you know, people have an idea. There are certain stories or movies that I just hated when I got to the end, but I didn't hate them after I'd seen them 2 or 3 times. And the reason is sometimes you have a expectation. You really think it's going to go a certain way, and when it doesn't, you're really angry. But later you go
Yeah, I
back and
think
you're like,
too.
okay, now that I know where it's going, there's nothing wrong with where it went. It just wasn't where I was expecting it to go.
I think too there was a bit of fatigue that had set in with My Hero Academia because infamously the whole like final third is really rushed in pacing. And this is absolutely true. Like as much as it has moments, individual moments here and there that I think are really good, the pacing is is way too fast. So I think everybody was kind of primed not to like the ending, no matter what it was.
Because
Whereas
it was too fast, they were forgetting what it was they really liked about it.
Yeah, they had already kind of like fallen out of love with the series. You know, I don't think it ever got that bad, to be honest with you. I do think that it moved too fast, but I think it had some really good moments, even in the final section. So I was still in kind of good spirits. Like I was willing to give Horikoshi his due. You know,
Yeah.
like on a good series by the time it got to the end, but. Like I think that was part of the why everybody reacted so negatively. But then he comes out with the epilogue, and in the epilogue, he literally just repeats like all of the stuff that I had been saying. Like he gives Deku a line of dialogue that is literally like, you know, being a teacher, even if I didn't get my powers back, I would have been satisfied being a teacher.
Good. I'm
Like
glad
I'm happy being.
I actually think that is kind of cool. So I mentioned earlier
Yeah.
that I had just rewatched Winter's Tale, and which is one of my favorite movies, but it did really badly. And I think it did really badly for the same reason we were just talking about, which is expectations. So they put the movie out at Valentine's Day. It's a movie about a guy who falls in love with this girl who dies halfway through the movie. So it really wasn't a good Valentine's Day movie. She does not actually come back from the dead like they're expecting. She just dies. It's not a love story, even though there's a lovely love story in it. And I've often thought, I think if they put it out at a different time of the year and they'd given a slightly different interpretation, it would have done really well. Because I've seen this movie at least 6, 7 times. I utterly love it. It's really cool. But
I tried, years ago when John first recommended it on his blog, I tried to find it and I could not find it anywhere.
we saw. I think we just saw it on
anywhere.
Amazon. But it's
it might have,
and it's much better than the book. I've read parts of the book and I couldn't get through the book. The book is like one of these modern books and it's surrealistic and kind of weird. But the movie isn't. The movie is just about the battle between heaven and hell. But the idea for the movie is every human being has a miracle. And when you get close to being able to use your one miracle that's meant for one other person, heaven will try to help you and hell will try to interfere. And so that's what it's about. And that's what happens in the movie. And I remember I showed this movie to my mom and she had never seen Russell Crowe before. And she was like, could that man possibly ever play a good guy? I was like, Mom, every other movie he's ever been in except for this one, he was a really good guy. But he does.
Let me see. Is it on? Yeah, you could rent it now. I
bought her a copy.
Okay. I'm gonna do that actually.
I bought her a copy of Cinderella Man to show him what he was like because her dad was taught boxing, but sadly she died before I ever got a chance to show it to her. But anyway, I recommend the movie, but you have to go in knowing that it's an eerie, it's a supernatural movie about a young thief who gets accidentally caught in the middle of a battle between heaven and hell, and not a romance. If you go in expecting a romance, like you were saying about the people who, were disappointed that Deku wasn't doing what they wanted him to do, you'll come away disappointed, But if you go in and you know what to expect, you might come out really enjoying it.
Cool. I just rented it. I'll probably watch it later.
Excellent. I hope you enjoy it.
I've wanted to watch it for years, I gotta say. I could not find it for the life of me. Maybe it went on Amazon recently, or maybe for whatever reason at the time I was stupid and didn't think to
it
check
wasn't
Amazon.
available for
I
a
don't
while.
know.
It is now, but I think it came out and then it disappeared because it didn't do that well. And the story behind the movie,
I see.
the making of the movie is really beautiful and sad. The director who made the movie, who's a guy who's done a bunch of other really big things. I can't recall offhand what it is, but like they're movies that you would have heard of. His wife died. And because his wife died, he fell in love with this story. And so it was like a labor of love. And a bunch of the people who are in it, like Jennifer Connelly and Russell Crowe and Colin, not Firth, this Scottish Colin Farrell, I think. Like they charge much less than they normally would and stuff like that to be in the movie because he had made movies that they like and they wanted to help him do this dream of his, And then they put it out for Valentine's Day and it just flopped, which I thought was heartbreaking because I really love the movie. It's just charming and funny and, but it also just has this really nice kind of heaven hell thing going on that's eerie. Like, I like the way it's done. I wish I could watch more stories that were in that kind of background. He gets just, I don't want to give anything away. The less you know about it, the better. But I do always tell people the girl died because I think it's actually better to know that she died and not be expecting a romance when you go in. But
okay,
other than that,
interesting. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking of, and the reason I brought up My Hero Academia and the romance in that, is there is a difference between like with these sorts of stories that I'm trying to think of how to put this. I'm having trouble wording it. There are some stories where the ending and the romances in it are extremely well received. The thing that I'm thinking of specifically, which I don't think you've seen, though maybe you have, is Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood.
I have not seen it. I don't know. And somehow I just never, there's certain things that you just kind of thought you were going to get to them, but you never did. Full Metal Alchemist, all of it is like that. I just somehow never got to it.
Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is my favorite anime ever. One of my favorite stories ever. It's one of those things that every few years I rewatch it to see, was I overselling it? Was it me at the time that I made it out to be better than I thought? Yeah, and I go, nope. The story I always tell with it is that I have, like you've mentioned this with fantasy, I have like the writer brain, right? Where anytime I watch something, even if it's good, I am always putting together in my head, like, why does this work? I do it with My Hero Academia.
Stopping and analyze it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't really hate this. I enjoy it actually a lot of the time. It's fun, but
I also like it
the way that I judge if I,
occasionally I want to take a rest and do something else, but most of the time I enjoy it.
But the way that I will judge something is, can it make me turn that part of my brain off? Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood was able to do this for me. There was a specific episode, which is the most famous episode of the show. I looked it up afterwards to see, like, am I the only one? Because I want to be like, am I the only one who thinks this is maybe like the greatest episode of television ever made? No, everybody loved it. Very famous. It's called Death of the Undying, and it was this episode where they need to fight a homunculus named Lust. And there is a distinct moment at the end of the episode. They are in this dramatic battle. One of the main characters is killed on screen. He's stabbed, killed. They're facing off against one of the protagonists. He gives a speech where the other person realizes that the other guy has died, and she gives up on life. She empties her gun into the homunculus, who, of course, revives immediately, and then says, just leave me here. I want to die. And Al, who is the character protector, goes, no, I'm sick of watching people die. And then you hear the voice of the character who was just killed go, well spoken. I couldn't agree more. And he shows up and he explodes the homunculus into fire. And I remember vividly in that moment, I think I was leaning forward in my chair and I audibly gasped at the screen. And when the episode ended, I like turned it off and wandered downstairs and grabbed my sister and said, you have to watch the show. And she's like, I'll get to it. I said, no, you don't get it.
You have to watch
I'm
it
like, I'm
now.
making you watch the show. And then she finished it. He's like, okay, yeah, that was incredible. So the ending of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood ends with a lot of pairings. And one of the interesting things about the show, which has a very, very active fan base, very big, very active, it's one of the only shows I've seen where the fans like universally love all of the romances.
Yeah.
I've never really seen anything like this, honestly. Everybody likes to mix and match. It's almost like you don't do it with Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. People won't be happy.
No, the romances are done really well, where the characters, you can tell why they are the guys who come together. You know, it's not just a
What's so interesting about it, though, is that romance is not at all the center of the show. Honestly, it's like, I would say it's almost a periphery thing. You know what I mean? Like, it's barely, it's a subplot of a subplot.
But they did,
right?
They did the pairings well enough that they make sense.
Exactly. Yeah. They do the pairings on the show extremely well. So there's in the finale, they use the finale as a sort the finale is really a sort of epilogue, right? They defeat the final villain in the previous episode, and then the final episode, they just kind of give everybody a nice happy ending, you know. And great, right? No issues with this. But one of the things that they do is the only major romance on the show that gets real closure is Ed, who is the protagonist, one of the two protagonists, and his love interest, who has been there, who's like a tsundere type of character, named Winry. And one of the things that drove me nuts about the show when I watched it and now, one of the only issues I have with it, they have a great scene. It's beautiful, honestly, where like Ed is about to leave for a foreign country. He's going to travel and come back, and Winry is there to see him off. And then Ed grabs her and says, hold on, I want to do an equivalent exchange with you, which has been the theme of the show. Right? Like everybody gives 50%. He goes, I give half of me and you give half of yourself. And Winry gets mad at him and says, you're always thinking of alchemy. Why can't you just accept that you're going to get 100% of me? Great line.
Yes, that is beautiful.
And then they both get embarrassed. And it's great. But Ed hugs her immediately after. And every time I see this, it drives me nuts. Because I'm like, why didn't you kiss her?
Yeah.
In this moment.
Yeah.
And then they show, like, they get together. They do a little, like, flash forward. They have kids and everything. It's like, kiss her, Ed. Kiss her.
Oh.
And I'm like, I feel like the kid at the end of The Princess Bride.
Yes. It's just a kissing story.
I think that's one of the best parts about romance. When you hit that sweet spot when everyone's like, kiss her. Kiss her, you fool.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, he doesn't, but it's not quite a romance. John's saying that Jack Burton does not kiss Gracie Law at the end of Big Trouble in Little China. And I must admit that I remember being annoyed at him for that, but it kind of fits his character.
Well, they do. Ben and I had gotten into Epic the Musical recently, which is a musical adaptation of the Odyssey, and I had that same experience.
I listened to some of it. I forget why I didn't finish it. It wasn't like I planned not to finish it. I just, like, my computer reboot and I forgot I was listening to it or something. But some of it was pretty cool.
This is one of my big triumphs with Ben. I got him into it, and he started listening to it on his own. It's one of the few times that I've gotten Ben, because most of the time Ben will watch my thing and go like, yeah, it was fine. if I can convince him to do it. But anyway, at the end of the final saga of Epic the Musical, the creator like releases a live stream with animations that go with the songs, which is really cool, by the way, that he does that. Like, super awesome. But anyway, in the final animation, when Penelope and Odysseus get back together, they're doing their final lines. They hug each other, and I'm like, why?
Kiss her, you fool! Oh.
Exactly. I mean, I don't want to say it drives me nuts, 'cause it's not really a big deal, but it's kind of annoying because I'm just like,
it's
why?
interesting.
Why didn't you kiss her?
I don't know if you've ever watched Indian movies, but nowadays it's not that way. But for a long time they thought kissing was like it's something you only do in private. So they didn't have any kissing. The more recent ones they do a little. I think they've been westernized. But it was kind of interesting because they would do all these other things. You know, it was actually quite romantic the way they would handle it. But they would put in a song where we would have a kiss. You know, they still were putting in something. You know, if you have neither a kiss nor a song, I think you're missing the point sometimes.
Yeah, it's interesting too, right? Because now I am in a very different situation now than I would have been like a year and a few months ago, right? Because I am engaged.
What?
And yeah, we have this joke about once an episode, and it goes roughly like this. And
you're living the
Ben's in the
romantic
wedding.
life.
Yes. Ben's in the wedding, and he makes this joke like roughly once an episode.
That makes it even funnier. Oh my gosh. Go ahead, keep talking. Don't let me slow you down.
Yeah, and sorry, it reminds me. I'm sorry, I'm going off topic, but this reminds me of a meme that was amazing. That was like, girls after they get engaged, it's like they tell their friend the next day. They go, "Oh, I got engaged to Tom today," and then she goes like, "Oh, OMG, and you didn't tell me for 6 hours? I thought we were friends." And then just like boys after they get engaged, and it's like 2 years later. "Oh, by the way, bro, I got married," and he goes, "Congrats, bro. I thought you were gay." And
all the girls are that way except my daughter. My daughter's friend at her wedding explained that my daughter had been dating her now husband for years before her friend found out. But the reason was that the guy was in China, and because they couldn't get back together because of the lockdown, they hadn't gotten back together to actually cement things. So she hadn't really told anybody about it. But the friend finally finds out that the Ping Ping is engaged, has a boyfriend, and Ping Ping finally gets to go off to China to see him like 4 years later. And I run into this friend at the bubble tea place, and I'm like, and this is right after the guy proposed to Ping Ping. I'm like, did you hear the news? And she's like, yeah, Ping Ping's been telling me everything. So I show her the picture of the proposal, and her jaw drops. Apparently Ping Ping had not.
I mean, yeah, I'm definitely somewhat private.
But
I will tell you that the way that I handled,
she was trying to talk back from China. You know, I don't even know if she'd had a chance to talk to her. But I just thought it was kind of funny that her poor friend found out both the existence of the guy and about the proposal, you know, kind of indirectly. But yes, in general, you're absolutely right about the girls and the guys. I think that's spot on.
Yeah, I will say, like, it certainly played out that way with my fiance and I. The way that I tended to handle it and still handle it is that I tell my family what I feel like I am obligated to tell them. Like, okay, I'm seeing this girl. I eventually was like, yeah, it's pretty serious with this girl. And then a few months later, it's like, okay, I'm going to propose in a week. And they're like, why? You're going to propose? Okay, it's like, I told you I was seeing her. Yeah, like, and then I'm like, I'm not, you know. I've been straight. I've been honest. I've been very straight with you. But yeah, it's very interesting because I will say that I'm trying to think of how to put this. There is very much being in the middle of it does make you see things differently in ways that I would not have expected. And I almost don't really like admitting that, because if I were on the other side, I would hate to hear that, right? Like, oh, there's, you'll never understand it, which isn't exactly what I'm saying, right? Like, you'll never understand it without being in it. I think when you write, you're ultimately always going to have to write, when they go write what you know, well, you're ultimately always going to have to write somewhat of what you don't know. You're going to have to write about experiences
Right.
you've never had
Right.
and try to render them accurately. Like
This is actually,
in Pinkerton's Ghost.
this is actually something I thought about
Yeah.
a whole lot. The process between being a writer and trying to imagine something, even if you haven't experienced it, to do the best job you can as a writer, versus when you've experienced, you do better. And it's kind of that, you want to do the best you can when you haven't experienced it. And yet, in fact, often if you do experience, you can do better. And yet then you go back to the thing you haven't experienced and you want to try to do the best you can. So I think, I think both, that if you've experienced it, you can make the most of something as a writer. But if you haven't, you still want to do your best trying to do it. You don't want to necessarily never write about romance because you've never had one. You know what I'm saying? But doesn't mean that if you have had one
Yeah.
that you might not have an insight you wouldn't have had otherwise,
Yeah, and I see it like it's always going to be unavoidable with many different things. Like I'm thinking of, like in Pinkerton's Ghosts, the characters are going through these horrific events at certain points that I have simply not went through. Hopefully I'll never go through. Maybe I'll go through similar types of trauma, obviously not of the weird supernatural type that they have, or at least probably not that. Yeah, probably not that. But I might go through some similar types of horrendous trauma. Like it can happen, but I haven't yet,
Right.
luckily.
And God willing, it won't. I mean, I'd much rather your writing be slightly less realistic and you never suffer something like that,
Right. But at the same time, it's like the only thing you could really do in these sorts of situations is, it's like history. Those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. Well, the reason that people keep repeating it is because it's very difficult to take the word of someone, right? Like, and it's the same thing. You got to take the word of people who have been there. When it comes to romance, like, I don't really like, I hate saying it because I feel like if it were me on the other side, I wouldn't want to hear that advice. You know what I mean? Of like,
I do.
It's going to be different once you're in the middle of it. It's like, thank you. That's completely unhelpful, but
It
it's
seems
good to
really
know.
unhelpful when we're the person who hasn't had the experience. And yet sometimes when you have had the experience, you go, oh my gosh, now I can see what he was saying, So as I say, I both think that it makes sense that the person who hasn't been there, still wants to do the best they can. And it makes sense that the person who has been there now has insights they didn't have before. I mean, both of those things.
Yeah. One of the things that I observe it like sort of a sociologist, right? Like as if I am on the outside looking at the event of being engaged and being in love. One of the things that has occurred to me as being different than I expected, but also that I clearly should have known if I had paid any attention to the poets and of the past, is it is much more intense than I would have thought.
Yeah.
Like the experience of being in love is very intense in a way that, even though you could have told me that everybody has said throughout history that if I had been paying any attention to anyone, right, they would have been like, yeah, like, people fight wars over this stuff. Like, of course it is. But you don't really get it until you're in the middle of
Right.
it.
And there
And then
just is
in
a
the middle
difference
of it and go,
between,
whoa.
there's just a difference between reading something and imagining it and experience it. Now, some people's imagination are really good. Like they find when they have the real thing that their imagination was pretty close. And some people not at all good. They have the real thing and they find out they weren't at all right before. But
I also think there's a certain genius that some people have who tend to be very, very good writers who are like, I once read a story. I do not remember who this was. so I couldn't tell you. But I remember reading an article that was like describing a certain author, and the author was like, she wrote the greatest book ever written on Catholics and Protestants in France off the basis of listening to a dinner table conversation between Catholics and Protestants in France. And this gave her all of the insight she needed. Or like G.K. Chesterton read like a biography on, he wrote a biography on Thomas Aquinas. He was not a Thomistic philosopher. He was really not a philosopher at all. In the strict sense, he was a critic, you know. But he was certainly not a Thomistic philosopher. And he wrote a biography of Thomas Aquinas that several Thomistic philosophers said is the greatest biography of Thomas Aquinas ever written, and the most accurate and concise and well explained explanation of Thomas's thought and worldview ever written. And Chesterton wrote this almost like on the fly, like he flipped through. So I don't want to be too flippant, but almost like he flipped through some works of Thomas Aquinas and then wrote this book where he completely accurately explained the work of Thomas Aquinas.
That's cool.
There's a certain genius that some writers have, I think, that are able to do that.
I was going to say earlier when we were discussing, the earlier part of this part of the conversation, there's having been there, and there's trying to imagine it, but there's a third step, which is some people have a kind of a genius for taking somebody else's experience and making the most of it. Like I think both of Waverly and of Gone with the Wind, in both cases, in Waverly, the version I was reading was footnotes. It's the first book by the guy who wrote Ivanhoe, and it's about the battle 60 years since from when he was writing. It's all through the book, 60 years since. The battle of that the same one that the Outlander series is about. But you could tell, because he footnoted all these real stories he wove in, that he must have heard guys talking about this his whole life. And the same thing with Gone with the Wind. The woman who wrote Gone with the Wind had never been, in the Civil War, but she, like her grandparents had. And she absorbed hearing all that they had to say in such a way that she was able to do a really good job. And I think some people just have a kind of a genius for absorbing somebody else's experience and able to bring it to life from what that person's point of view has put across, even if they themselves haven't actually done the thing themselves.
Yes. Also, we're in the last 2 minutes, so I'm going to read what the comments say. Star Storyteller says, "Hey friend, the best line," he's referring to Epic the Musical, and he says, "The best line in Epic the Musical is when the villain asks the hero, 'How will you live with yourself?' And Odysseus replies, 'Next to my wife.'" I know what he means. It's a little confusingly worded. So there's a moment where Odysseus in Epic the Musical takes on Poseidon directly. This does not happen in the Odyssey, but he does do it in Epic. He has to fight Poseidon directly, and he tortures Poseidon at the end of the fight in order to get him to turn off the storm that's keeping him away from Ithaca. He grabs his trident and stabs him, and throws Poseidon's words in his face, that ruthlessness is mercy upon yourself. And finally, Poseidon calls off the storm and says, "After everything you've done, how will you sleep at night?" As Odysseus walks away, and Odysseus says, "Next to my wife."
Oh, that's really
and
good.
Then the song ends.
That's what his whole story is about, is getting next to his wife.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's excellent. It's funny because the song itself is like arguably the worst song of the show, but that moment is really, really good and kind of makes up for the whole rest of the song. And this is coming like, I love Epic the Musical. What was that, Ben?
It's a pretty good moment of catharsis in that part of the story.
Now, I love Epic the Musical, so this is
That's really good. Yeah, that's really cool.
But that
It's
line,
wonderful.
that
And
song is probably
that's
the worst part
a
of it.
line that, you know, that's I'm quite a fan of Odysseus and Penelope. There's references to them
Oh,
in the book I'm writing now.
I will say this is
So
on
I
theme.
understand completely that I mean, without hearing the rest of the song, it's just great.
I will say this, and it's on theme. If I had to give, I mentioned about Penelope. One of the reasons I love Epic the Musical so much is I already liked it even before we really got to Penelope, which is in the very last part of it, the Ithaca saga. But one of the reasons it's so good is that I think that Penelope is adapted perfectly. Honestly, dead on, in a way that I don't think you could really do unless you're just some guy. You know, like what I mean is Hollywood couldn't do it. You couldn't do it in a movie or a show. They would never be able to adapt her correctly. But because Jorge is just some guy who decided to do this, he is able to make an entirely lore accurate Penelope. It has everything that you're hoping to see without masculinizing her in any way.
Oh, that's great.
If that makes sense.
That's great.
It's she has a song called The Challenge, which is awesome, where it goes through all of her motivations. The challenge, of course, to shoot the arrow through 12 axes, and it has one of the best lines in the entire musical. She says, "Let the arrow fly once you know that your aim is true." And she's speaking to the suitors, but she's also speaking to everybody else, right? The listener. And she goes, "Because I'd rather die than grow old without the best of you." And of course, the double meaning of the line is that she doesn't think any of them are going to be able to fulfill the challenge.
Right. And the one she'd
And
rather
she would
die
rather,
than grow
the only
without
one
is, of course, Odysseus.
Odysseus. The only one who could fulfill the challenge is Odysseus.
One reason
so she's telling them all she would rather die than not be with Odysseus. Beautiful line. Awesome. But
one of the reasons she's such a wonderful, I don't mean in the musical because I haven't heard her in the musical. I mean, in general, one of the reasons she's such a wonderful character is because she's so utterly true in this world where almost no one else is, you know? And it just
precisely, there was a very bizarre article I read by a feminist who has a lot, and the article was like, you know, someone really, like, you could think of Odysseus as being lucky because at least he gets to travel the world. And I remember reading, going, what? Like, I think I almost like dropped my phone. I'm like, you can't be serious. Like, over and over and over again, the Odyssey just calls him the most unfortunate man in the world.
He's a man of sorrows type guy.
And then they go, yeah, but at least, and it became a running joke with me and my sister where we would go like, but at least he got to travel. And then you go like, he did get kidnapped by Calypso and raped on her island for 7 years, but at least he got to travel. And
hey, John, what's the name of the movie where George Clooney plays it takes place in like the 40s, but he's escaping from jail, but it's based on the Odyssey?
Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou?
Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou?
Where Art Thou? Yeah. There were a
awesome
couple
movie.
little Odysseus related things in that I just loved. I mean, with the touch of the Odyssey was really light, you know. I mean, and sometimes it was kind of forced, but there was just enough of it in there that was kind of charming.
I thought it was a great movie. I loved, Man of Constant. I know what you're thinking.
The Man of Constant Sorrows. That's why I was thinking about that, because I was thinking that song. That was my favorite part of the movie, was that song. So.
Yep, and I remember hearing it and thinking like, that is perfect for Odysseus.
Yeah, it really is.
Awesome. But yeah, I remember reading that, but they also said something in there where they go like, someone, you know, it leads one to wonder like why Penelope was faithful for so long. And I'm like, did an alien write this? Because this feels like an alien who doesn't know how humans act, who wrote this article. Because it's like, because I almost feel dumb for explaining it, like I'm patronizing to you, like because she was in love with Odysseus.
Yeah.
Like, that's it. That's the answer.
Because he was really powerful and strong and cool, and these guys were jerks. I mean, it's like, here's the thing. it's not like she was being wooed by somebody impressive who she liked. I mean, this isn't a love triangle. It's not Penelope is being, Achilles has come to try to seduce a Bella or Apollo or somebody. This is a group of jerks she really doesn't like versus her super impressive husband,
Right. The suitors are all horrible people. Like it's so weird. Okay. More from Star Storyteller. She says by the way, it is she says I'm a woman. That's why research is really helpful, even if you have experienced it yourself. And she says, she also says in response to what I was just saying, man suffers, woman most affected. Which,
that's good.
yeah. Yeah. So, anything else you want to say about the Kickstarter before we go? I will say that I have donated to get the book. So,
well, I would just say
anything that you want to tell people?
There's a bunch of things on there. There's getting the book. There's getting the videos. There's getting all the videos. The others are already made, and I can turn them over to you almost immediately if it funds. There's a level for naming a character. You can name a character to appear in something I'm writing, like Rachel Griffin or something like that. There's some classes available, and I'm kind of retired, but I put editing a book on there. Somebody really wants a book edited. But that's what's on there. Hopefully it will be enjoyable for people. And, it was really fun to work with Ken and Ben. So that was actually why I came up with the idea of doing this. When we all got together, Shingatig, I thought, I had such a good time making those videos with Ken and Ben. Maybe we could do some more. So that's where this came from. So.
Absolutely.
That's good to know. And Ken is very, very good. So.
Yeah, he's delightful. He does such a great job. Anyway, thank you guys so much for having me on. And it's always just a delight to talk to you guys. And, just keep doing the good stuff you're doing.
It's a pleasure.
One day I'm going to once I read through more of One Piece, I'm going to invite you on.
Oh, you should.
I've been procrastinating on it.
I could talk on One Piece for hours.
Once I get through, I think it was Water 7, people have kept recommending to me to get through. Once I get through Water 7, maybe we'll contact you again on to talk about One Piece.
I didn't really enjoy One Piece until Water 7. I used to watch it with friends, and I was doing laundry, and I wasn't really paying attention. It was just another fighting story. And two things happened. One was that we were watching Bleach at the same time, and at that point, Bleach was getting kind of bad, and One Piece was getting better. And the other was that in Water 7, the problems hit home more because they involved one of the crew members, and suddenly it was super good. And I was really sold on it from that point of view. Now, Water 7 is around episodes 250, somewhere in there. 250 is the end of Water 7. I really, really, really fell in love with One Piece at episode 490.
Yeah, I'm currently in the Skype. arc.
So it gets better. It definitely gets better for Water 7. My favorite part of it at all is between episodes 490 and 500. That's where it really completely and utterly won me over. But by Water 7, once I got well into that, I suddenly went from, okay, we're watching One Piece again, to, hey, this is really enjoyable. I want to see more of it. So, that's when it took off for me.
I do want to.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
I do. Sorry, we are continuing over to time, and I must put the kibosh on this, or I will listen to you, lovely people, chat forever, which is, I'm sure, a delight.
Damn it, Beth.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe someday we'll be on to talk about One Piece officially. Absolutely. But for right now, thank you guys so much, and have a wonderful rest of your Sunday.
Do dear listeners, check out Jaji's Kickstarter. I do like I'm eyeing up the video tier right now. There's also many other tiers that you can check. I put a link in the comments. Do check us out next week as we have Mr. Alquist over to talk about GK Chesterton, which I think will be very nice for everyone involved. Especially as we're starting to move into UATV. Hello to unauthorized. I'm sure everyone is busy with the football game that is going on, which I am told is very important. But since the Rams left St. Louis, nothing has been important. It has been gray, rainy days, except for those times when I can support my friends and allies in the fight in their Kickstarters, in their work, in all their things that they do. And thank you for joining me with